Imagine dedicating your life to serving others, only to find yourself lost in your own assumptions and mistakes. In today's story, we follow Jake Winters, a police officer who confronts his own biases and flaws after a painful incident with a community member. He's about to take on a journey filled with suffering, accountability, and a struggle for redemption. As he faces the weight of his actions, Jake learns that real change isn't easy. It's earned every day. Will he find a way to rebuild the trust he's broken? Or is it too late? Stay with us to see how Jake's journey unfolds, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Every comment helps us understand more about the themes of justice and growth in stories like these. Let's dive into Jake's story and see how one man's path to redemption might change everything. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the busy city street, where pedestrians moved in constant waves, chatting, shopping, and rushing along their day. Jake Winters stood on the edge of the sidewalk, his gaze sharp and calculating as he observed people moving by. He wore his police uniform with a sense of authority, his shoulders squared and his posture radiating a subtle tension. Jake had been in the force for nearly a decade, and in that time, he had developed a particular sixth sense for spotting suspicious individuals. Unfortunately, his sense was often biased, drawing conclusions based on preconceived notions that he rarely challenged. He narrowed his eyes, glancing at his surroundings with the air of someone on edge, ready to spring into action. Today, his gaze settled on a woman standing by herself on the corner, leaning against a lamppost. Her gaze was fixed somewhere ahead, her body relaxed and posture steady. Jake noted her calm, collected demeanor, but something about her bothered him. He couldn't quite place why he felt the urge to confront her, yet he was sure that he had reason enough. The woman, Ruth, seemed oblivious to his gaze. She wore a dark blue jacket over casual clothes, her hair neatly tied back, and her stance spoke of quiet confidence. Ruth's dark skin and calm expression contrasted sharply with the sense of suspicion Jake felt. In his mind, she was out of place, standing alone, seemingly doing nothing, which to him was reason enough to question her presence. Without much thought, Jake's bias crept in, fueling his decision. He adjusted his uniform belt, feeling the weight of his authority as he crossed the street, his footsteps purposeful and loud. Approaching her, he let his presence be known before speaking. "Ma'am, do you mind telling me what you're doing here?" Ruth glanced at him with mild curiosity, unfazed by his abrupt question. "I'm just waiting," she replied calmly, her voice even. Jake's eyes narrowed. The lack of fear or nervousness in her response unnerved him. He wasn't accustomed to this level of calmness, especially from someone he had decided was suspicious. He took a step closer, his voice dropping a degree. "Waiting for what exactly? This isn't the place for just waiting, especially if you don't have business here." Ruth raised an eyebrow but remained composed. "Officer, is there a law against standing here?" she asked, her tone polite but steady. Her response irked Jake further. He was used to people reacting with apprehension, maybe even a bit of fear, but her straightforwardness felt like a challenge. "Are you giving me attitude?" he demanded, his tone growing sharper. When an officer asks you a question, you're expected to answer it. Ruth held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm answering you, officer. I don't believe I'm doing anything wrong by standing here." The tension between them grew palpable, a visible standoff forming as people nearby started to slow their pace, casting curious glances their way. Jake could feel eyes on him, but his focus remained squarely on Ruth, his authority feeling questioned, something he didn't handle well. To him, she was showing defiance, and that alone was enough to make his blood simmer. "Do you have any identification?" he pressed, holding out his hand expectantly. His tone was cold, as though issuing an unspoken threat. Ruth's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't see why that's necessary," she replied. "I'm not doing anything illegal, so there's no reason for me to show ID." Jake's patience wore thin. He leaned in, his posture dominating and his voice lowering as he hissed, "Are you refusing a direct request from a police officer?" Ruth exhaled slowly, her calm unwavering. "I'm not refusing, but I am questioning why you're demanding it." The challenge in her tone struck a nerve. To Jake, She was a person who shouldn't be questioning his authority, much less holding her ground. He wasn't accustomed to being defied in such a manner. His irritation, paired with a long day of frustrations, started to tip him into an aggressive mindset. "Look," he snapped, "I can make things very difficult for you if you keep this up. I've got every right to demand identification if I feel there's a reason for it." A faint smile flickered across Ruth's face, barely noticeable. "Do you actually have a reason, officer?" she asked, her voice unshaken. Jake's jaw clenched. He hadn't expected her to remain so calm and collected under pressure, and it felt like a slap to his authority. As an officer, he knew he was supposed to de-escalate situations, but his pride felt threatened. Deciding he needed to assert his authority, he reached out and grabbed her arm. "Enough games," he muttered. "You're coming with me until we can figure out exactly what you're up to." A sharp intake of breath from a passerby reached his ears, but Jake ignored it, too focused on asserting his control. Ruth, however, held herself firmly, her expression finally shifting into one of disappointment. "You really think this is necessary?" she asked, her tone carrying a weight that hinted at a deeper meaning he failed to grasp. Jake merely tightened his grip, convinced that he was doing the right thing. "Yes, it is. We'll see how calm you are once we get to the station." The street around them had fallen into an awkward silence as people observed from a distance, sensing the tension and perhaps feeling the injustice. Jake's hand dug harder into her arm as he led her, his mind set on teaching her a lesson. He didn't notice the way Ruth glanced around, her gaze settling on a couple of bystanders who discreetly took out their phones, capturing the moment. As they walked, Ruth maintained her calm, her expression growing colder, but she refrained from struggling. The energy in the air grew dense, a brewing storm that neither fully understood. Jake's grip remained unyielding, his authority the only thing he cared about in that moment. Just before they reached his patrol car, Ruth paused, forcing him to stop. She turned to him, meeting his gaze directly. "This will be interesting to see unfold," she murmured, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of finality. Jake scoffed, his frustration reaching a boiling point. "We'll see how tough you are once you're behind bars," he said, attempting to intimidate her further. Without another word, Ruth stopped resisting altogether, her expression resolute. She was done explaining herself, and the look in her eyes seemed to convey something he couldn't understand yet, a sense of inevitability that hinted at an unexpected turn of events. Little did Jake know, this encounter would soon become one of the most unforgettable moments of his career, challenging everything he thought he understood about authority and power. Before we continue with this heartwarming story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. This is how you can contribute and help us continue bringing meaningful stories about justice and overcoming challenges. Click the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's keep going. The walk from the street corner to Jake's patrol car stretched on, and although Ruth moved cooperatively, her calm demeanor unsettled Jake. He expected resistance, maybe even fear, but instead, she radiated an eerie composure that made him grit his teeth. He tightened his grip on her arm, leading her with authority, while his eyes darted around, catching the curious stares of bystanders who paused to watch the scene unfold. "Officer, you don't need to hold me so tightly," Ruth commented, her voice measured. "I told you, I'm not resisting." Jake ignored her, tightening his hold even further. "Funny, isn't it? People like you always think you're above the law, don't you?" he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. Ruth raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Her silence irritated him, as if she were silently judging his every move. Reaching the patrol car, he pressed her against it, a little rougher than necessary. The cold metal made Ruth shiver, but she kept her expression neutral. Jake fumbled with his keys, glancing around as a few people gathered in clusters, phones pointed in his direction. One of the onlookers, a middle-aged woman with a purse hanging from her shoulder, called out, "Hey, what's she done wrong?" Jake shot her a withering glare. "Mind your own business, lady. This is police work." The woman didn't flinch. "I just don't see why you're handling her like that," she insisted, her tone bold and disapproving. Others around her murmured in agreement, creating a quiet chorus of discontent. Ruth glanced over her shoulder at the crowd, then back at Jake, her eyes calm but intense. "Looks like they're not convinced of my danger, officer." "Shut up," Jake hissed. "You think you're clever, don't you? Standing there with that smug look, acting all innocent. But I can see right through it." Ruth took a steadying breath, the cold air biting into her lungs. "All I've done is stand on a public sidewalk," she replied. "Is that a crime now?" Jake scoffed, unlocking the back door of the patrol car and giving her a small shove. "Why don't you tell me what you were really doing? I know you were up to something." Ruth stepped into the car without resistance, folding her hands in her lap as he slammed the door shut. She could hear him muttering to himself as he circled to the driver's seat, his steps heavy and tense. He threw open the door, climbed in, and sat in silence for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly as if grounding himself. The interior of the patrol car was sterile, with faint traces of coffee lingering in the air, mingled with the scent of disinfectant. Ruth remained composed, studying Jake out of the corner of her eye as he started the engine. As they drove, Jake broke the silence, his tone dripping with disdain. "What's your name?" "Ruth," she replied simply, her gaze fixed ahead. "Last name?" he demanded. She looked at him briefly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Why don't you run my ID when we get to the station?" Jake bristled. "Oh, so now you think you're calling the shots?" Ruth shrugged. "I'm just saying, you seem to be in such a hurry to drag me downtown. Might as well do things properly." Jake's fingers tightened on the wheel, his knuckles turning white. "People like you always have something to hide. You think you're smart, playing the innocent card. But I've seen it before." She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What exactly do you mean by people like me, officer?" The question hung heavily in the air, sharp and precise. Jake's jaw clenched, his gaze fixed ahead, refusing to meet her eyes. "Don't twist my words," he snapped. "Then say what you mean," Ruth replied, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems you're making assumptions." Jake's irritation spiked. "You think you're some sort of saint, huh? Just standing around, waiting to be a nuisance. I know your type." Ruth's gaze didn't falter, her eyes unwavering as they bore into him. "Maybe you don't know as much as you think, officer." Silence settled in the car again, thick and charged with tension. Jake could feel the weight of her stare, unyielding and steady. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the road, but he couldn't shake the growing unease in his chest. After several minutes, they pulled into the station. He parked the car with a hard jerk, stepping out and marching around to the passenger side. Yanking open the door, he gestured for Ruth to get out. "Come on, let's see how smart you feel after a little interrogation." Ruth stepped out, smoothing her jacket as she rose to her full height. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You really believe this is necessary? Don't act like you're above this," he snapped. "You're here because you've brought this on yourself." They walked into the station, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over everything, making shadows look sharper, more defined. The front desk officer glanced up, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of Jake hauling in Ruth, his grip firm on her arm. Ruth noticed the curious look but remained silent as Jake led her past the front desk, toward the interrogation rooms. Once inside, Jake roughly guided her into a chair, leaning down to meet her eye level. "So, Ruth, if that's really your name, you mind telling me why you were standing around looking so suspicious?" Ruth crossed her legs, keeping her composure. "Suspicious? I was standing on a public sidewalk. That's hardly grounds for arrest." Jake rolled his eyes. "Quit playing games. People like you don't just stand around without a reason. So, let's hear it. What were you doing?" She sighed, glancing up at the ceiling, as if searching for patience. "Officer, I told you. I was simply standing there." His patience snapped. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound reverberating through the small room. "Enough with the attitude. You think I won't push this further?" Ruth's gaze finally sharpened, her calm facade slipping just slightly. "Careful, officer. Your anger is showing." Jake clenched his fists, his face reddening. I don't need you telling me how to do my job. Then maybe you should start doing it properly, she retorted quietly, her voice like a blade. Because right now, all you're doing is feeding into your own bias. He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Bias? Oh, please. This has nothing to do with bias. I've seen people like you, thinking you can just walk around like you own the place, ignoring authority. She shook her head slowly, the faintest hint of disappointment in her eyes. I wonder if you'll feel the same way once the truth comes out. Jake frowned, his suspicion flaring. What's that supposed to mean? Ruth leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest, her eyes steady on his. It means that maybe you should take a good look at yourself, officer. This situation says more about you than it does about me. Silence fell again, heavier this time, as Jake felt a flicker of doubt creep into his mind, but he pushed it aside, unwilling to let her words sink in. He was convinced that he was in the right, that she was hiding something. As they sat there, locked in a battle of wills, neither of them willing to back down, the tension thickened, an unseen force pressing down on the room. And while Jake couldn't admit it to himself, a small part of him wondered if, perhaps, he had made a mistake he couldn't easily undo. Jake sat across from Ruth in the small, windowless interrogation room. The harsh fluorescent light cast shadows under their eyes, amplifying the tension that had grown thick and oppressive. The room was stark and bare, with only a metal table between them and 2 chairs on either side. Jake's gaze drilled into Ruth, his impatience evident, as though willing her to finally break under his scrutiny. But Ruth sat calmly, her posture steady, her hands folded in her lap. She looked as though she could sit there forever, unmoved by his authority or his anger. This unwavering calmness irritated Jake to no end, and he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, bringing his face close to hers. "Let's make this simple," he began, his voice cold and calculated. "Who are you really? What were you doing there, standing around and waiting like that?" Ruth met his gaze, unflinching. "I've already answered your questions, officer. I was simply standing on a public sidewalk. There's nothing illegal about that." Jake's jaw clenched. He was used to seeing fear, nervousness, maybe even desperation from people he brought in, but Ruth's unyielding calm grated on his nerves. "You're a real piece of work. You know that," he sneered. "Think you're above the law?" She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I think I understand the law very well, officer. Probably better than you think." "Oh, do you now?" he scoffed, sitting back, crossing his arms as though challenging her to explain. "Go ahead. Enlighten me." Ruth took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "It's quite simple. I understand that standing in a public space is not grounds for arrest. I also understand that you have not once provided a legitimate reason for your actions, other than your own discomfort." Jake's face flushed, his patience reaching its breaking point. "You think you're clever, huh? Standing there like you're innocent. But I know the type. You're hiding something. People like you always are." Ruth's gaze sharpened. "And what exactly do you mean by people like me?" He faltered for just a second, but his anger pushed him forward. "You know exactly what I mean. Always playing the victim, acting like you're some sort of saint when really you're just waiting for a chance to cause trouble." Ruth leaned forward, her voice low and even. "Officer, you're making assumptions about me based on nothing more than your own bias. And you've let that bias justify treating me like a criminal." Jake's fist slammed down on the table, rattling it slightly. "I don't have to justify anything to you." The door opened suddenly, and a second officer, Lisa Morales, stepped in, her brows knit in concern. She looked between Jake and Ruth, her expression a mix of confusion and alarm at the tension in the room. "Jake, what's going on here?" she asked, her tone cautious. Jake shot her a glare, his mouth a thin line. "I'm in the middle of questioning a suspect, Morales." Lisa's eyes flicked to Ruth, who was sitting composed, watching the exchange with a faint, detached interest. Lisa took a step forward, addressing Ruth. "Ma'am, do you mind telling me what this is about?" Ruth looked at Lisa, her expression softening slightly. "I was standing on the sidewalk, waiting. This officer decided that was grounds to bring me in. Lisa's gaze shifted back to Jake, her eyes narrowing slightly. Jake, is this really necessary? She doesn't look like she's resisting or causing any trouble. Jake let out a frustrated breath, running a hand through his hair. She's playing games, Morales. Acting all innocent when I know she's hiding something. Lisa's expression grew more serious, and she leaned in, lowering her voice slightly. Jake, are you sure about this? You know we have protocols to follow. We can't just bring someone in because they look suspicious. She's provoking me, he snapped, his voice rising. Ruth's calm gaze drifted back to Jake. Provoking you? By answering your questions? Jake leaned forward again, his fists clenched. You're sitting there like you're untouchable, like the rules don't apply to you. The rules don't apply to your biases, officer, Ruth replied evenly. I'm here because you chose to bring me here, not because I've done anything wrong. Lisa sighed, sensing the volatility in the room. She placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, trying to calm him. Jake, maybe it's best if I take over. You seem tense. He shook her off, his face growing redder. No, I'm handling this. He turned back to Ruth, his voice cold. Tell me who you really are. Last chance. Ruth raised her eyebrows. You're giving me an ultimatum? When all I've done is sit here and answer your questions. Lisa's patience finally wore thin. Enough, Jake. This isn't going anywhere. She looked at Ruth, offering a small, apologetic smile. Ma'am, I'm going to speak to my colleague outside for a moment. We'll be right back. Jake glared at Lisa, but allowed her to pull him into the hallway. Once outside, she turned to him, her tone hushed but firm. What are you doing, Jake? She hasn't done anything. He shook his head, his jaw set. I know she's hiding something, Lisa. I can feel it. Feel it. Lisa's brow furrowed. That's not how we operate. You need evidence, not just a feeling. You're letting your bias cloud your judgment. Jake scoffed. Bias? You think this is about bias? I'm trying to keep the streets safe. Lisa crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. And dragging an innocent woman into interrogation for standing on a sidewalk is keeping the streets safe. Jake's face flushed again, but he avoided her eyes. You wouldn't understand. Maybe not, but I understand that you're not handling this by the book, Lisa replied, her tone softening. Listen, take a break. Let me talk to her. You need to calm down. Jake opened his mouth to protest, but something in her eyes made him pause. She wasn't angry, just concerned. He finally exhaled, tension leaking from his shoulders. Fine, he muttered. You deal with her. Lisa gave him a brief nod before stepping back into the room, closing the door quietly behind her. She approached Ruth, her demeanor much gentler, and sat down across from her. I apologize for that, ma'am, she said softly. Jake can be intense. He's had a long day. Ruth's eyes softened slightly, but her expression remained guarded. I understand. It seems he's made a few assumptions about me. Lisa nodded, choosing her words carefully. We all have our moments. But if there's anything you'd like to clarify, I'm here to listen. Ruth studied her, a faint smile appearing. Thank you, Officer Morales. I appreciate your professionalism. Lisa smiled back, sensing Ruth's sincerity. I understand this might have been uncomfortable for you. We're here to serve and protect, not to create tension. Ruth's gaze hardened slightly, though she kept her tone respectful. Then perhaps Jake should remember that. Lisa nodded, glancing down briefly. I'll speak to him. For now, is there anything you need? Ruth shook her head, her expression thoughtful. Nothing at the moment, but I believe we'll be talking again soon. Officially. Lisa's eyes widened slightly at Ruth's words, a hint of something unsettling beneath them. She couldn't quite place it, but she sensed that Ruth wasn't just an innocent bystander. There was a depth to her, something she wasn't revealing. Well, Lisa said, standing up, thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Ruth. We'll clear this up shortly. Ruth nodded, watching as Lisa stepped out of the room, leaving her in silence once again. But this time, Ruth allowed herself a small, knowing smile. She knew that before the day was over, Jake's world would change in a way he hadn't expected. and that every assumption he'd made about her would be shattered. Ruth sat alone in the cold, stark room, her gaze calmly fixed on the door as she waited. The thin, uncomfortable chair pressed against her back, but she didn't let it show. Her expression remained steady, her breathing even, as though she were merely passing the time. Outside, Jake paced the hallway, his mind racing with a confusing mix of anger and frustration. He could feel Lisa's gaze on him, scrutinizing, disapproving. Her words had struck a chord, and although he didn't want to admit it, a part of him wondered if he was indeed letting something cloud his judgment. But he shook it off. He couldn't afford doubt now. Ruth was hiding something. He was sure of it. Steeling himself, he swung the door open and stepped back inside, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow on the scene. Ruth looked up, her gaze meeting his without a hint of hesitation. She didn't even flinch as he entered, her calm demeanor only intensifying his irritation. "Are we ready to continue?" Ruth asked, her voice even, almost polite. Jake ignored her question, pulling the chair out roughly and sitting down across from her. He leaned forward, his fists pressed into the table, his gaze hard. "I'm done with the games, Ruth. You're going to tell me what you were really doing on that street corner." Ruth tilted her head slightly, studying him. "I've told you multiple times, officer. I was standing there, minding my own business." He let out a frustrated sigh, slamming his hand down on the table again. "Stop pretending. You know as well as I do that you were up to something." Ruth's gaze didn't waver. Instead, she leaned back slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "It seems you're more invested in this than I am. Why are you so determined to make me guilty of something?" Her words hit a nerve, and Jake's expression darkened. "Because people like you." Ruth's eyebrows shot up, her voice cutting him off like a blade. "People like me? Go on, officer. Finish that thought." Jake hesitated, feeling the weight of her gaze bearing down on him. He was no longer the one in control here, and it irked him. He leaned in, his voice low. "People like you think you're clever, slipping under the radar, pretending to be innocent. But I know better." Ruth's smile widened, though her eyes remained serious. "Is that so? And just what am I supposed to be slipping under the radar for, officer?" He faltered for a moment, searching for words, but his frustration quickly overshadowed his logic. You're hiding something, and I won't stop until I find out what." Ruth folded her hands, her tone almost gentle. "Have you considered, officer, that perhaps the only thing I'm hiding is the truth about why you feel the need to intimidate me?" Jake scoffed. "Intimidate you? You think this is intimidation?" Ruth's eyes softened, almost pitying him. "You're putting words in my mouth now. I haven't accused you of anything, but your reaction says more than enough." Jake opened his mouth to retort but stopped, struggling to formulate a response. Ruth's steady demeanor was breaking down his confidence, piece by piece, and he hated the way it made him feel. He clenched his fists, leaning forward until he was almost nose to nose with her. "Enough of this. I have every right to question you if I find you suspicious, and believe me, you're giving me plenty of reason to feel that way." Ruth looked him dead in the eyes, her voice soft but firm. "Officer, have you considered that perhaps the only thing that's suspicious here is your obsession with proving me guilty of something I haven't done?" Jake's face flushed with anger, and he gritted his teeth. "You know what? Keep playing your little game, but I'll find out what you're hiding, even if it takes all night." The door swung open again, and Lisa stepped back in, her expression troubled. "Jake, we need to talk. Now." Jake shot her an irritated look. "I'm in the middle of something." Lisa didn't back down. "It's important." He hesitated, glancing between her and Ruth. Finally, he stood up, following Lisa out into the hallway. The door closed behind them, and Jake crossed his arms, his expression defensive. "What is it, Morales?" Lisa took a deep breath. "Jake, you're crossing a line here. I just got off the phone with the lieutenant, and he wants to know what's going on. This whole thing is going to turn into a mess if you keep pushing it." Jake's eyes narrowed. "You called the lieutenant?" "I had to. This is getting out of hand. You're treating her like a criminal without any real evidence." Jake scoffed, his voice rising. She's hiding something, Morales. Can't you see it? She's taunting me, acting like she's above all of this. Lisa sighed, shaking her head. Jake, I don't know what's going on with you, but you need to take a step back. We don't treat people like this without cause. He clenched his fists, feeling his frustration simmer beneath the surface. You're just as blind as everyone else. She's playing all of you. Lisa's expression softened, a hint of sympathy in her eyes. Jake, I think you need to ask yourself why you're so focused on proving her guilt. Is this really about her, or is it something else? Her words struck him, and for a moment, he was at a loss. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The uncertainty gnawed at him, and he hated it. Finally, he turned away, avoiding her gaze. Fine, you handle it. Lisa watched him, concern etched on her face. Just think about what you're doing, Jake. This could come back to haunt you. With that, she turned and re-entered the interrogation room, closing the door softly behind her. Ruth looked up as she entered, her expression unreadable. Lisa offered a small, apologetic smile. I apologize for the intensity. Jake can be a little passionate. Ruth raised an eyebrow, her tone dry. Passionate? That's one way to put it. Lisa took a seat across from her, her demeanor calm and professional. I understand this has been difficult. If there's anything you need to clarify, I'm here to listen. Ruth studied Lisa for a moment before speaking. Thank you, Officer Morales. It's refreshing to see someone who still values professionalism. Lisa nodded, a hint of a smile on her face. We're here to protect, not intimidate. Ruth leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. Then I hope you'll take this to heart, Officer Morales, because the consequences of what's happening here will be significant. Lisa's smile faded as she sensed a hint of something ominous in Ruth's tone. What do you mean? Ruth's eyes held hers, unblinking. All I mean is that actions have consequences, officer. It's just a matter of time before those consequences catch up. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine, though she couldn't explain why. I see. Ruth straightened, her expression softening. But I appreciate your fairness. It doesn't go unnoticed. Lisa managed a nod, feeling unsettled but unsure why. She pushed her chair back and stood, trying to maintain her composure. Thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Ruth. We'll sort this out soon. Ruth offered a polite smile as Lisa left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Alone once more, Ruth leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a brief moment of satisfaction. She knew that the truth would soon unravel, and that Jake would face the consequences of his choices. Ruth sat alone once again in the empty, echoing interrogation room. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sterile glow on the metal table between her and the empty chair across from her. She leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, though a hint of weariness had crept into her eyes. She knew this entire ordeal was pointless, yet she couldn't shake the awareness that things were about to change, perhaps more than Jake anticipated. Outside, Jake paced the hallway, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He clenched his fists and ran a hand through his hair, muttering to himself. Lisa's warning still echoed in his mind, though he dismissed it as misplaced sympathy. To him, Ruth's calm was an act, a manipulative facade hiding something sinister. After a moment, he steeled himself and stormed back into the room, the door slamming shut behind him. Ruth looked up, her expression unreadable, as she took in his tense stance and clenched jaw. "Back so soon?" she asked, her tone light, but there was a hint of sharpness beneath her words. Jake ignored her sarcasm, pulling the chair out and sitting down with a thud. He leaned forward, his gaze hard and intense. "Enough of this game, Ruth. This isn't going to end well for you if you keep it up." Ruth arched an eyebrow, her voice measured. "What exactly do you think I'm hiding, officer? I've answered your questions, yet you keep insisting on something more. Do you even know what you're looking for?" Jake's eyes narrowed. "You're mocking me, acting like you're innocent, but I see right through it. I know there's more to you than you're letting on." Ruth's calm remained unbroken. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with a faint smile. "Is that so? Then enlighten me, officer." What do you think I am? He slammed his hand down on the table, causing a loud clang to echo through the room. Enough with the smart mouth. You're in here because I have reason to believe you're a threat. You're not as innocent as you pretend to be. Ruth's smile faded, and her gaze grew cold. She leaned forward, her voice lowering to a steady, controlled tone. The only threat here, officer, is the prejudice you carry. Jake scoffed, crossing his arms. Oh, here we go. Blaming me now? Huh? Claiming I'm the one in the wrong? Maybe you should consider that possibility, Ruth replied, her voice unwavering. You've let your assumptions guide every step of this investigation. Not once have you stopped to think that perhaps I'm exactly who I say I am. Someone who did absolutely nothing to warrant this. Jake leaned in closer, his voice dripping with contempt. And why should I believe anything you say? You're too calm, too collected. People like you. You think you can slip under the radar and get away with things. But I'm not falling for it. Ruth's eyes flashed with something. Not anger, but a controlled intensity. You're clinging to a story that only exists in your mind. Officer, do you have any actual evidence against me? Anything concrete? He faltered for a second, the question catching him off guard. But he quickly recovered, shaking his head. I don't need evidence to know when something's off. Ruth let out a quiet, bitter laugh. So that's how it works now, is it? Guilty until proven innocent? He glared at her, his frustration reaching a boiling point. I don't have to justify myself to you. She held his gaze, unflinching. No, officer, you don't. But you might want to consider what happens when this comes to light. When people see what you've done here, dragging an innocent person into this room, treating them like a criminal without a shred of evidence. Jake smirked, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. Is that a threat? Ruth shook her head slowly. It's a fact. Actions have consequences, officer, and yours are stacking up. The room fell into a tense silence, and for a moment, Jake felt the weight of her words. But his pride refused to let him back down. He leaned forward again, his tone harsher. Maybe it's time I taught you a lesson about consequences. He reached for his radio, pressing the button and speaking into it. Morales, bring in the background check on Ruth here. I want every detail. The crackling of the radio filled the silence, followed by Lisa's voice on the other end. Jake, we've run the check. There's something you need to see. He frowned, irritation flashing in his eyes. Bring it in then. Within minutes, Lisa entered the room, a hesitant expression on her face. She held a thin file in her hands, glancing between Jake and Ruth with a look of unease. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then stopped, her gaze drifting to Ruth. Lisa, what's in the file? Jake demanded, his patience wearing thin. Lisa's eyes flicked to Ruth, who remained silent but wore a calm, knowing expression. Finally, she handed the file to Jake. Maybe you should read it yourself. Jake snatched the file from her hands, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the contents, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion, and then, slowly, to shock. His mouth opened slightly, his jaw slack as he processed what he was seeing. Detective Ruth Ellis, undercover with the Internal Affairs Division, he read the words aloud, the realization sinking in like a stone. Ruth watched him calmly, her gaze never wavering. I believe you found what you were looking for, officer. Jake's face paled, his hands trembling slightly as he closed the file. He looked up at her, the full weight of his mistake crashing down on him. Your internal affairs? Ruth nodded, her expression cool. Yes, and I was in the area, performing a surveillance operation. Your actions disrupted that operation. Jake's mind raced, struggling to find something to say, but his thoughts were tangled, panicked. But you didn't. You didn't say anything. Ruth's gaze hardened. It wasn't my job to explain myself to you, officer. My job was to observe. But you decided that my presence alone was grounds for suspicion. Lisa watched the scene, her face tense with discomfort. Jake, I tried to warn you. He ignored her, focusing entirely on Ruth. His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. Why didn't you say anything sooner? Ruth's expression softened, but only slightly. Because, officer, I wanted to see how far you would take this. I wanted to see if you would actually question yourself, or if you'd let your assumptions dictate your actions. Jake's eyes darted between her and Lisa, his mind reeling. He felt the weight of everything he'd said and done pressing down on him, suffocating. He opened his mouth, searching for something to justify his actions, but he found nothing. Ruth continued, her tone firm but not unkind. This could have ended differently, officer, but you chose a path that reflects on your character, your biases, and your inability to question your own judgments. That's something you'll need to address. He sat back in his chair, his hands limp on the table, staring blankly at the file. He had been so certain, so convinced of her guilt. But now, faced with the truth, he felt his confidence crumble, exposing the fear and doubt he'd buried beneath his authority. Lisa broke the silence, her voice gentle but firm. Jake, maybe it's time you took a step back. You've crossed a line today. Jake closed his eyes, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He nodded slowly, too ashamed to look at either of them. I didn't know. Ruth stood, gathering her composure. She looked down at him, her gaze softer now but unyielding. Ignorance isn't an excuse, officer. Remember that. With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts, the file still clutched in his hands. Lisa watched her go, then turned back to Jake, placing a hand on his shoulder. We all make mistakes, Jake, but it's what we do next that matters. Jake sat in the interrogation room, the thin fluorescent light overhead casting an unforgiving glow on the file in front of him. His mind was still reeling from the revelation. Ruth Ellis, the woman he had treated with disdain and suspicion, was a detective with internal affairs, someone his department trusted and respected. The truth gnawed at him, each thought a sharp reminder of the monumental error he'd made. He looked down at his hands, clenched tightly on the edge of the table, knuckles white with tension. The door opened softly, and Lisa stepped in, her expression cautious as she took in the sight of Jake. Shoulders slumped, gaze vacant, almost as if he were in shock. She closed the door quietly behind her, the sound pulling him out of his thoughts. Jake? She began, her tone gentle yet probing. She didn't sit down but instead leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching him with a mixture of concern and disappointment. Are you all right? He let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. All right? No, Morales, I'm not all right. He gestured vaguely toward the file. Did you know about her? About all of this? Lisa shook her head. No, I didn't know. But maybe if you'd taken a moment to question yourself, to look past your assumptions. She trailed off, letting her words hang in the air. Jake clenched his jaw, his frustration shifting, not just toward Ruth or Lisa but toward himself. He wanted to argue, to push back, but the words died in his throat. He looked up at Lisa, his gaze raw, the vulnerability in his eyes uncharacteristic and jarring. I thought I was doing my job, he said quietly. I thought I was protecting people. Lisa softened, though her expression remained serious. And how exactly were you protecting anyone by bringing her in? She was standing on a sidewalk, Jake. Standing. Yet you treated her like a criminal. Jake opened his mouth to respond, then hesitated, his mind scrambling for a defense. But he found none. The scene replayed in his mind, every word he'd thrown at Ruth, every attempt to intimidate her, and the stubborn resistance he'd felt when she refused to cower. Now, each of those moments felt like a weight pressing down on him. I don't know, he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know why I did it. I saw her standing there, so calm, and I thought she was mocking me. Lisa sighed, pushing herself off the wall and taking a step closer. You thought she was mocking you because she was calm? Jake, does that make sense to you? He looked away, avoiding her gaze, feeling the sting of her words. It's just people don't act that way. Not when I'm questioning them. She didn't even flinch. Maybe because she had nothing to hide? Lisa suggested softly, though there was an edge to her voice, a challenge. Jake shook his head, his frustration bubbling up again, though this time directed inward. I don't know. I I just felt like she was challenging me. Lisa let out a slow breath, her gaze softening. Jake, that's the thing. You let your feelings dictate your actions. You let your assumptions, your biases, guide you. And look where it got you. The words stung, but he knew they were true. He looked down at the table, feeling the weight of everything he'd done pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. I don't know how to fix this, Morales. How do I even begin to fix this? Lisa was silent for a moment, watching him, as if searching for something. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but not unkind. Maybe you start by acknowledging it. Maybe you start by admitting to yourself that you made a mistake. Jake clenched his fists, the truth of her words sinking in painfully. He took a shaky breath, forcing himself to look up at her, his gaze hollow. What am I supposed to say? Sorry doesn't seem enough. Maybe it's not, Lisa said quietly. But it's a start. The door opened once more, and to Jake's surprise, Ruth stepped back into the room, her gaze calm yet unyielding. She closed the door behind her, her eyes meeting his without a trace of anger or resentment. Instead, there was a kind of quiet determination in her expression, as though she had come to deliver something necessary, something he needed to hear. Jake's throat tightened, and he felt his heart pound, uncertainty gripping him as he tried to form the words he needed to say. But as Ruth moved to sit across from him again, the silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Ruth broke the silence. Officer Winters, do you understand why we're here? Jake swallowed, his voice low. I think so. Ruth's gaze remained steady, piercing. Then tell me why we're here. He hesitated, searching for the right words. Because I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I saw you and I assumed you were a threat. Without any reason, without proof. Ruth nodded slowly. That's right. And that's the problem, officer. You let those assumptions take control. And if you let that continue, it won't just be me. There will be others, people you're supposed to serve, people you're supposed to protect. And instead, you'll harm them. Jake winced, the reality of her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. I didn't think it would get to this. Ruth leaned forward, her tone measured. But there was a steel edge to her words. But it did. And it will keep happening if you don't take a hard look at yourself. If you don't ask yourself why you felt the need to see me as a threat. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze, his voice a whisper. I don't know why I did it. I wish I knew. Ruth's expression softened, though she remained firm. Maybe that's something you need to figure out. For yourself. Because this isn't just about me, officer. It's about how you see the world. Lisa watched them, her expression unreadable, but there was a quiet understanding in her eyes. Jake felt her gaze on him, but he couldn't look up. His mind was a chaotic swirl of emotions, shame, regret, and a profound sense of confusion. He had spent so long being certain, being sure of himself, that this sudden exposure of his flaws felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice raw. I'm sorry. For everything. I didn't know. Ruth regarded him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. It's not enough to just say sorry, officer. What matters is what you do from here on out. Jake nodded, the truth of her words sinking in. He felt a weight lift, though the burden of what he'd done would remain with him. I understand. Ruth stood, her expression calm but resolute. Then prove it. Prove that you understand. Not with words, but with actions. She turned to leave, her footsteps steady as she made her way to the door. Before she opened it, she glanced back, her gaze meeting his one last time. This isn't just about me. It's about the people you serve, the people who depend on you to do your job without prejudice. Jake nodded, feeling the finality of her words sink in. He looked down at his hands, feeling the weight of his actions settle in his chest. The door closed quietly behind Ruth, leaving him alone in the room, the silence echoing around him, a harsh reminder of everything he needed to change. Lisa placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice soft. Now's the time to make things right, Jake. Don't let this be the end. Let it be the beginning. He looked up at her, nodding slowly, his face filled with determination. He knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, he felt the stirrings of something new, a chance to change, to make amends, and to become the officer he had always believed himself to be. After Ruth left the interrogation room, Jake sat in silence, replaying every moment of the encounter in his mind. He felt as though the floor had been pulled out from under him. The harsh light above made everything seem stark and unforgiving, each shadow sharper, each sound echoing in the empty room. The guilt was like a weight, pressing down on him, suffocating. Lisa walked back into the room after a few minutes, her gaze soft but direct. She had always been a steady presence in the precinct, the one to balance out Jake's intensity with her calm. She sat down across from him, crossing her arms as she watched him, not with anger, but with something that looked almost like pity. "Jake," she started quietly, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "I think it's time you face what this really is." He looked up at her, his eyes tired and a bit hollow. "What do you mean?" Lisa sighed, her expression thoughtful as she weighed her words. "You didn't just make a mistake, Jake. This wasn't some small error in judgment. You let your assumptions about her guide you, and it took you down a very dangerous path." Jake clenched his fists, struggling to find the right words. I thought I was protecting people. I thought she was hiding something. She was hiding something." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "She was doing her job, Jake. She was there for a reason, a legitimate reason, and you disrupted that. You turned her presence into a threat when it wasn't one." He looked away, shame creeping into his expression. "I didn't see it that way. Because you didn't want to," she replied, her tone firm but not unkind. "Jake, we all have things we need to work on, but you need to be honest with yourself about what you saw when you looked at her. Was it her calmness that bothered you, or was it something else?" Jake shifted uncomfortably, the question settling in like a weight on his shoulders. He wanted to deny it, to brush off the implication, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was truth in her words. I don't know," he admitted quietly. I didn't think she belonged there." Lisa watched him carefully, her gaze searching. "And why was that, Jake? Because she was standing on a corner? Because she was calm? Or because she didn't look like what you thought she should?" Jake's face flushed, the shame deepening. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was raw and ugly, and he could feel it bubbling to the surface. Lisa leaned forward, her tone softening. "Jake, nobody's asking you to be perfect, but if you can't face your own biases, you're going to keep making the same mistakes. And next time, you might not be so lucky." He swallowed, the weight of her words settling heavily in his chest. He looked down at the table, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to." Lisa placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but grounding. "I know, but intentions don't change what happened. The only thing that matters now is what you do with it." Jake nodded slowly, the reality of his situation sinking in deeper. "Do you think she'll report this? What I did?" Lisa's expression grew somber. "If she does, she'd be well within her rights. You didn't just overstep, Jake. You crossed a line. And it's a line that could cost you more than you realize." The words struck him like a blow, and he felt the sting of fear creeping in. "I could lose my job, couldn't I?" Lisa looked at him, her expression compassionate yet firm. "Maybe, and maybe that's something you need to think about. If this badge means so much to you, then maybe you need to consider what you're willing to do to earn it back. Not just keep it, but earn it." Jake closed his eyes, the realization sinking in like a lead weight. He'd spent years on the force, working hard, climbing the ranks. The idea of losing everything he'd built, everything he'd fought for, was a bitter pill to swallow. "I don't know how to fix this, Morales," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know where to start." Lisa's gaze softened, and she gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. "You start by being honest with yourself, and by accepting that this isn't just a matter of saying sorry. You need to make real changes, Jake." He looked up at her, a spark of desperation in his eyes. "Do you think she'll give me a chance? To explain, to try and make this right?" Lisa sighed, her expression thoughtful. That's not something you can demand from her. But you can reach out, ask for her forgiveness, and then show her that you mean it with your actions. Jake nodded slowly, a flicker of hope igniting in him. Maybe I can talk to her. Lisa gave a slight nod, her eyes filled with a gentle encouragement. It's worth a try. But remember, Jake, this isn't about what you want. It's about doing the right thing, whether or not she chooses to accept it. He stood up, his movements slow as he processed everything. The weight of his actions still pressed heavily on him, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of clarity, a sense of direction. "Thank you, Morales," he said, his voice genuine. She smiled, patting his shoulder. "Just remember, this is the first step of many. It's not going to be easy, but if you're serious about making a change, then it's a journey worth taking." With a final nod, Jake left the room, feeling a strange mixture of dread and determination. He knew what he had to do, and though he feared Ruth's reaction, he also knew that facing her was the only way forward. He found Ruth in the precinct lobby, preparing to leave. She looked up as he approached, her gaze steady, calm, but with a hint of guardedness. Jake hesitated, his heart pounding as he gathered his courage. "Detective Ellis," he began, his voice faltering slightly. I wanted to talk to you. If you're willing to listen." She studied him, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she nodded. "I'm listening." He took a deep breath, steadying himself. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I know that might not mean much, considering what I put you through, but I mean it. I was wrong." Ruth nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "And what are you planning to do about it?" The directness of her question threw him, but he held her gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm going to work on myself. I'm going to question my biases, my assumptions. I don't want this to happen again, to anyone else. I want to be better." She regarded him carefully, weighing his words. "Good. Because it's going to take more than an apology to undo what happened here." Jake swallowed, nodding. "I understand. And if there's anything I can do to help, to make amends, I'll do it. I know it's not your job to fix my mistakes, but if there's anything..." Ruth's expression softened just a little, a hint of compassion in her gaze. "The best thing you can do, Officer Winters, is to make sure that this was a one-time mistake. Learn from it. And if you truly want to make amends, then show it through your actions, not just words." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "Thank you, Detective, for everything." She gave a slight nod. "Good luck, officer. You're going to need it." With that, Ruth turned and walked out of the precinct, leaving Jake standing alone in the lobby. The echo of her footsteps lingered, a final reminder of the path he now had to walk. As he watched her go, he felt a strange sense of peace. The road ahead would be hard, but for the first time, he knew that he was ready to take responsibility, to face the truth, and to change. A few days had passed since Jake's encounter with Ruth, and the weight of that day lingered over him like a dark cloud. He replayed every word, every look she had given him, feeling both regret and a nagging sense of confusion. But even with all the reflection, he couldn't quite shake the resentment he felt. Somewhere deep down, he struggled to accept that he was entirely in the wrong. At the precinct, whispers had begun to circulate. He could feel eyes on him, his colleagues' gazes laced with curiosity and judgment. A quiet tension hung in the air, with few people daring to speak directly to him. But he knew what they were thinking. Jake could feel the walls closing in around him, the reputation he'd worked so hard to build slowly slipping through his fingers. And yet, the bitterness in his chest refused to dissolve entirely. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk, pretending to be absorbed in paperwork, Lisa approached him, her face serious. She pulled a chair over, settling in beside him. Jake glanced up, meeting her steady gaze, feeling the familiar mixture of respect and unease that her presence often brought. "Jake, we need to talk," she said firmly, folding her hands in her lap. "And not just about what happened with Ruth. I need you to be honest with me." Jake shifted uncomfortably, glancing around. "Lisa, I've already told you. I know I messed up. I'm doing my best to fix it." Lisa shook her head, her expression unyielding. No, Jake, this isn't just about admitting you made a mistake. This is about understanding why it happened in the first place. He clenched his fists, irritation bubbling up. I already told you. I thought she was hiding something. Why though? Lisa pressed, her tone quiet but insistent. What about her made you think that? Was it really her behavior? Or was it something else? Jake's face flushed, anger prickling at his skin. What are you trying to say, Lisa? She leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. I'm saying that maybe it's time you examine your own biases, Jake. I've seen the way you handle certain people. People who don't fit the mold of what you think is normal or safe. You're quick to judge, quick to assume the worst. Jake scoffed, crossing his arms defensively. So now you're accusing me of being, what? Racist? Lisa's expression didn't change, her voice calm and steady. I'm not accusing you of anything, Jake. I'm asking you to look inside yourself and see if there's something there you've been ignoring. Bias isn't always a conscious choice. Sometimes it's something you've internalized without even realizing it. He let out a sharp breath, his gaze hardening. You think I'm biased? That I treat someone differently because of something like that? Lisa sighed, her tone softening slightly. Jake, I know you're a good cop, but I also know that sometimes our experiences, our upbringing, can shape the way we see the world and the way we see people. All I'm asking is for you to consider that maybe there's something you need to work on. Jake's jaw clenched, the resentment simmering. And what about her? She didn't have to act the way she did. She knew exactly how to get under my skin, did she? Lisa asked, raising an eyebrow. Or was she simply calm and composed in a situation where she shouldn't have needed to prove her innocence? He looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. I don't know. I can't shake this feeling that she was testing me. Lisa nodded slowly. Maybe she was. And maybe she had every right to. But what does that say about you, Jake? If her calmness, her composure, made you feel threatened, isn't that something you should be questioning in yourself? The question hung in the air, a heavy silence settling over them. Jake could feel his defenses crumbling, bit by bit, as her words sank in. The truth was uncomfortable, like a wound he'd been ignoring, and now it throbbed, demanding his attention. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and filled with frustration. What am I supposed to do, Lisa? Just admit I'm some biased cop and walk around feeling guilty all day? No, Lisa replied gently, her voice steady. But you can start by acknowledging that there are things you need to work on, by recognizing that we all have blind spots, and that doesn't make you a bad person. It just means you have room to grow. Jake let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Growth. Right. And what happens when everyone else sees me as a failure? You think they'll just forgive and forget? Lisa placed a hand on his arm, her touch firm but comforting. Jake, people are watching how you handle this. If you show them that you're willing to change, to learn from this, they'll respect you for it. But if you keep denying it, acting like you're the victim, then you'll only prove them right. He looked down, the weight of her words sinking in. The anger he'd been holding on to began to dissipate, replaced by something colder, harder to ignore. A sense of shame he could no longer deny. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can do it, Lisa. I don't know if I can face all of this. Lisa squeezed his arm gently, her gaze filled with understanding. You don't have to do it alone, Jake, but you do have to be honest with yourself. That's the first step. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. And what if I mess up again? What if this is just who I am? She shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Jake, I don't believe that for a second. You have the capacity to change. I've seen it, but it's up to you to take that step. He took a deep breath, feeling the tension release just a little. So, where do I even start? Lisa's smile grew, a hint of warmth breaking through her serious demeanor. Start by listening, by observing. Challenge those thoughts when they come up. And, most importantly, don't be afraid to ask for help. Jake nodded slowly, absorbing her words. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. a sense of direction he hadn't felt in days. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. "Thanks, Morales," he said, his voice genuine. "I don't know what I'd do without you." She gave his arm a reassuring pat before standing up. "Just remember, Jake, this is a process. You're not going to fix everything overnight, but every step you take matters." As she left, Jake sat alone, staring at his reflection in the window across the room. For the first time, he saw a man willing to confront his flaws, a man determined to change. And though the journey ahead was daunting, he felt a quiet resolve settle within him. He would make amends. He would change. And he would become the officer he had always aspired to be, one who served with empathy, respect, and integrity. The precinct felt colder, emptier than usual as Jake moved through the hallways. He'd been avoiding the break room and taking the longer route to his desk, hoping to minimize contact with his colleagues. The whispers hadn't stopped, and he could feel the weight of their glances, each one piercing through him with judgment. Every step reminded him that his reputation was now hanging by a thread. As he reached his desk, he noticed an envelope sitting atop his pile of paperwork. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but he opened it cautiously, his brow furrowing as he pulled out a neatly folded letter. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching, but the room was empty. The letter was short, the words carefully written. "Officer Winters, this may not be my place, but I wanted to offer you something I hope you'll accept. My perspective. In this job, we encounter so many different people, and it's easy to fall into patterns of assuming the worst. But every day, we have a choice. I believe you can make the right one. Don't let one mistake define you. Let it guide you towards something better." Anonymous. Jake sat back in his chair, the words echoing in his mind. He knew the letter was well-meaning, but it stung. A reminder that someone, even anonymously, felt the need to tell him to choose better. He wondered who had written it. Morales? Maybe another officer he barely knew? Or maybe it was from someone higher up, someone who saw his recent actions as a stain on the department's reputation. His thoughts were interrupted as Lisa approached, carrying her coffee mug, her expression neutral. She glanced at the letter in his hands, her eyes narrowing slightly with curiosity. "What's that?" she asked, nodding toward the paper. Jake folded the letter and slid it into his desk drawer. "Just a reminder to do better," he muttered, unable to hide the bitterness in his voice. Lisa raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "Looks like someone cares enough to reach out. That's a good sign, Jake. It means people think you're worth it." He let out a scoff, his gaze hardening. "Worth it? Really, Morales? Doesn't feel like it." Lisa tilted her head, studying him. "It sounds like you're more focused on the judgment than the opportunity." Jake looked away, frustration bubbling up. "What opportunity, Morales? To be reminded every day of how badly I messed up?" She sighed, setting her coffee down on the edge of his desk. "Jake, you keep looking at this like it's something happening to you. But have you considered that this is about something bigger than just your feelings?" He clenched his jaw, the bitterness in his chest rising. "So what, Morales? I'm just supposed to smile and act like everything's fine while everyone's whispering behind my back?" Lisa's gaze softened, her voice calm but firm. "No, Jake, but you don't need to prove anything to them. The only person you need to prove something to is yourself." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "What if I can't do it, Lisa? What if this guilt, this feeling, never goes away?" Lisa's expression remained steady. "It won't go away if you keep running from it. The more you avoid it, the bigger it'll get." Her words hung in the air, pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake off. He knew she was right, but the fear of facing himself, of examining every flaw, was paralyzing. He'd built his life on certainty, on a black and white sense of right and wrong. Now, everything felt gray, muddled. "Fine," he muttered, glancing at her. "Where do I even start?" Lisa gave him a small smile, the kind that felt both encouraging and grounding. "Start with the hardest part, forgiving yourself. This is a long process, Jake, but you don't have to figure it all out today." He shook his head, the words sounding hollow. "I don't know if I can do that." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to be sure. You just have to try. They fell into a comfortable silence, with Lisa's reassuring presence calming the storm inside him. But as he looked at her, something else stirred within him. A memory he'd been trying to bury. The familiar face of his father flashed before him, his stern voice, the constant drilling into him that weakness was unacceptable, that showing doubt was a failure. "Morales," he began, his voice hesitant, "did you ever have someone who made you feel like admitting you're wrong was the worst thing you could do?" Lisa's eyes softened, understanding flickering across her face. "Jake, we all have people who shape us, for better or worse. But that doesn't mean we have to keep carrying their weight forever." He felt his throat tighten, the fear and vulnerability bubbling up. "My dad, he always taught me that showing any weakness was I was giving up. And I think I've been living with that my whole life." Lisa nodded, her gaze filled with empathy. "That's a heavy burden, Jake, but it doesn't have to be yours to bear. Maybe it's time to let go of that." He swallowed, feeling the sting of tears he refused to let fall. I don't know how to let go of something that's been there for so long." Lisa gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "One step at a time. You don't have to do it all at once. But maybe start by forgiving yourself for not being perfect." He gave her a faint, shaky smile, the smallest flicker of hope igniting within him. "Thanks, Morales. I don't know what I'd do without you." She smiled back, her eyes warm. "We're a team, Jake, and I'm here for you, no matter what." With that, she stood, her presence lingering even as she walked away, leaving him with his thoughts. For the first time in days, he felt a tiny sliver of peace, as though the weight on his shoulders had lightened, if only slightly. But he knew there was still a long road ahead, and facing himself would be the hardest part. As he stared down at his desk, the letter calling to him from the drawer, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The desire to change, to be better, not for anyone else, but for himself. And that, he realized, was the first step. A few days passed, but Jake could feel the tension festering within him. Every step he took in the precinct felt heavier, and the glances from his colleagues, though fleeting, weighed on him. Yet he could sense that these weren't just ordinary looks of curiosity. They were laced with doubt and disappointment. He couldn't shake the feeling that his reputation, his sense of authority, had been fundamentally shaken. As he sat at his desk, lost in thought, he heard footsteps approach. Looking up, he found Officer Dan Keller standing by his desk. Keller was a longtime officer, known for his gruff exterior and no-nonsense attitude. He looked at Jake with a guarded expression, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Got a minute, Winters?" Keller's voice was low, cautious. Jake nodded, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Sure, Keller. What's on your mind?" Keller sat down, his gaze never leaving Jake's face. "I heard about what happened with you and that internal affairs detective. Word travels fast around here." Jake shifted uncomfortably, bracing himself for a lecture or, worse, outright criticism. "Yeah, I figured as much." Keller leaned forward, folding his arms on the desk. "I gotta be honest, Jake. I'm struggling to understand how you let things go that far. We've been on the force for years. You know how this works. So what happened?" Jake felt his face flush, the shame crawling up his neck. I made a mistake. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought she was hiding something." Keller's eyes narrowed, his tone unrelenting. "And what exactly gave you that impression?" "She was standing on a street corner. That doesn't exactly scream criminal to me." Jake's jaw tightened, feeling the sting of Keller's words. "I know how it sounds, all right? But at the time, I was convinced she was up to something." Keller let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You were convinced? Jake, that's just another way of saying you didn't have proof, only assumptions. And assumptions are dangerous. You know that better than anyone." Jake's shoulders slumped, the weight of Keller's disappointment settling heavily on him. "I messed up, Keller. I know that now. But what am I supposed to do? I can't go back and change it." Keller's gaze softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. "No, you can't change it. But you can own it. You need to face the fact that this wasn't just a simple mistake, Jake. This was a failure to see the person in front of you, to see her as more than just some suspect. Jake looked down, unable to meet Keller's gaze. I didn't mean for it to happen like that. I don't know. I got caught up in the moment. Getting caught up is no excuse, Keller replied, his voice growing softer but not losing its edge. You've been on this job long enough to know the difference between following your instincts and letting your biases run the show. Jake's stomach twisted, the truth of Keller's words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. What am I supposed to do, Keller? Everyone's looking at me like I'm some kind of disgrace. Keller leaned back, crossing his arms as he considered Jake's words. If you want people to see you differently, then prove you're different. Show them that you're willing to learn from this. Jake looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and desperation. You really think they'll give me that chance? Keller sighed, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. People around here? They respect honesty. They'll forgive a lot if you're willing to own up to it and make things right. But if you keep pretending like it's just going to blow over, they'll lose whatever respect they have left. Jake nodded slowly, the weight of Keller's words settling on him like a heavy burden. It's not easy, you know. Admitting I messed up, facing everyone every day. It feels like I'm carrying this around all the time. Keller softened, his gaze almost sympathetic. It's supposed to feel that way, Jake. That weight? That's your conscience reminding you that you're human, that you've got things to work on. If you're carrying it, it means you're still willing to learn. Jake took a deep breath, feeling a faint sense of relief at Keller's words. For the first time, he didn't feel completely alone in his struggle. Thanks, Keller, he said quietly. I don't know what I'd do without people like you and Morales, pushing me to be better. Keller gave him a faint smile, though his eyes remained serious. Just remember, Winters, being better isn't a one-time thing. It's a choice you make every day, and it starts with treating people like people. With that, Keller stood up, giving Jake a firm nod before walking away. Jake sat back, the room growing quiet around him once more. But something about the conversation had lifted a part of the weight he'd been carrying. Keller's words echoed in his mind, grounding him, pushing him to confront the reality of what he needed to change. Later that day, as Jake was preparing to leave, he spotted Lisa at her desk. The sight of her brought a rush of gratitude and a sense of guilt. He walked over, clearing his throat to get her attention. "Hey, Morales," he said, his voice softer than usual. She looked up, her face lighting up with a small smile. "What's up, Jake?" He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I just wanted to say thank you for sticking by me, for helping me see what I needed to see." Lisa's smile grew warmer, her eyes filled with understanding. "You don't need to thank me, Jake. I'm just glad you're willing to do the work." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, well, it's not like I had much choice. But it's easier with people like you in my corner." She reached out, giving his arm a gentle squeeze. "Remember, Jake, this is just the beginning. Real change takes time. But as long as you're willing to try, you'll get there." He looked at her, a hint of determination in his gaze. "I will, Morales. I want to make this right, not just for everyone else, but for myself." She nodded, her smile never fading. "That's the spirit." As he left the precinct that evening, Jake felt a small flicker of hope for the first time in days. The road ahead was still daunting, but the support of his colleagues and the encouragement from people like Keller and Morales had given him a sense of direction. He wasn't alone in this journey, and for the first time, he truly believed that he could change. With each step, he felt a little lighter, the burden easing as he committed himself to becoming a better officer, a better person. The doubts remained, the fear lingered, but the resolve to confront his mistakes burned brighter than before. Jake knew he still had a long way to go, but he was ready to take that journey, one step at a time. As the weeks passed, Jake immersed himself in his work, each day trying to prove to himself and to others that he had learned from his mistakes. He took on assignments he might have otherwise ignored, volunteered for community events, and made a conscious effort to listen more closely during interactions with civilians. But despite his efforts, the shadows of his past mistakes continued to loom over him. One afternoon, while reviewing case files, Jake saw a familiar figure walk into the precinct, Ruth. She was talking to Lisa, who had welcomed her warmly, and the two exchanged a few words before Ruth's gaze flickered toward Jake. He felt a jolt of unease but forced himself to meet her gaze, offering a nod. Lisa, catching the silent exchange, gestured for Ruth to join Jake at his desk. The tension grew palpable as Ruth approached, her expression unreadable, her presence reigniting the memories of that painful day. "Detective Ellis," Jake began, rising from his chair to greet her. I didn't expect to see you here." Ruth raised an eyebrow, her tone calm yet pointed. "Just Ruth is fine. Officer Winters. I'm here for a consultation on a case, not for pleasantries." Jake felt his cheeks flush, sensing the weight of her words. "Of course. If there's anything I can help with, just let me know." Ruth's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him for a moment. "Actually, I wouldn't mind a moment of your time. There's something I've been meaning to say." Jake swallowed, his pulse quickening. He nodded, gesturing to an empty meeting room nearby. "Let's talk in there." They entered the room, and as the door closed behind them, Jake felt a flicker of dread. He was acutely aware of the silence that filled the space between them. Ruth took a seat, crossing her arms as she watched him, her expression firm. "Look, Ruth," he started, his voice tense. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to deal with right now, but I've been trying. I'm trying to change." Ruth's expression remained unreadable. She took a slow breath before replying, her tone measured. "I'm aware of that, Officer Winters, and I'll give you credit for it. But trying isn't the same as understanding." Her words stung, but he forced himself to listen. "I get that," he replied, his voice low. "But I'm doing everything I can to make things right." Ruth leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "And do you know why you're doing it? Why it matters?" Jake hesitated, feeling her words dig into the parts of him he'd been struggling to face. "Because I made a mistake. I was wrong about you." She shook her head slowly, her eyes piercing. "It's not about me, Jake. It's about everyone you might encounter in this job. You didn't just misjudge me. You let your assumptions shape the way you treated me. And that's dangerous." He swallowed, the weight of her words pressing down on him. I know. I see that now." Ruth's gaze softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. "But do you really? Or are you just saying what you think I want to hear?" The question caught him off guard, and he felt a surge of frustration rising, mixed with guilt. "I'm trying to be honest, Ruth. I'm not perfect, but I'm doing my best." Ruth held his gaze, her expression both challenging and compassionate. "It's not about perfection, Jake. It's about accountability. You can't undo what happened, but you can take ownership of it. And that means facing the parts of yourself you've been avoiding." He let out a shaky breath, his voice barely a whisper. "I know, and I want to face it. But it's hard." Ruth nodded, a hint of understanding in her eyes. "Change is hard, but you don't get to hide behind trying as an excuse. People's lives are at stake here, and if you let your biases control your actions, it's more than just a mistake. It's a betrayal of the trust the public places in you." Her words hung in the air, the weight of them settling over him like a heavy shroud. He felt the guilt clawing at him, sharper than before, but he also felt a strange sense of relief. Ruth's honesty was painful, but it was also grounding. I never thought about it that way," he admitted quietly, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't see how my actions could hurt someone so deeply." Ruth leaned back, her gaze softening. "I'm not here to make this easy for you, Jake, but I am here to hold you accountable, because that's what you owe the people you serve. And if you're serious about changing, then you need to start by understanding that." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in deeper. "Thank you, Ruth. I mean it. I needed to hear that." She studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I believe you want to change, Jake, but wanting it isn't enough. You have to live it every single day, and it won't always be easy." He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. "I will. I'm willing to do the work, even if it takes the rest of my career." Ruth nodded, a faint smile breaking through her serious expression. "Good. Because real change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, and if you're truly committed, you'll find that it's worth it. Jake felt a surge of gratitude, the relief almost overwhelming. Thank you. I don't know if I deserve your patience, but thank you for giving me the chance to make things right. Ruth stood, her expression softening even more. I'm not here to grant forgiveness, Jake. That's something you'll have to earn, but I can acknowledge the effort. Just make sure it's real. He nodded, understanding the depth of her words. I will. I promise. With a final nod, Ruth turned to leave, pausing at the door to give him one last look. Good luck, Officer Winters. Don't waste this chance. As she walked out, Jake stood in the empty room, the echoes of her words lingering in the silence. He felt a strange mix of relief and determination, a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew the road ahead was long, filled with challenges and self-doubt, but he was ready to take it on. As he returned to his desk, Lisa caught his eye, giving him a small nod of encouragement. Jake managed a faint smile, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just doing this to redeem himself in the eyes of others. He was doing it to become the person he'd always believed he was capable of being. For the first time, Jake felt that he was on the right path, even if it was a difficult one. And as he settled back into his work, he knew that this was only the beginning of a journey toward redemption, one that he would commit to every day, for as long as it took. A few days after Jake's conversation with Ruth, he found himself sitting alone in the precinct's break room, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee in his hands. His thoughts felt heavy, tangled, and for the first time, he realized how deeply this journey had begun to affect him. He'd started questioning everything, not just his actions with Ruth, but his entire approach to the job, his assumptions, his understanding of justice. As he was lost in thought, Lisa entered the room, carrying a folder under her arm. She paused, noticing Jake's distant expression, and then moved toward him, her footsteps soft. "Hey, Jake," she said, setting the folder down on the table and taking a seat across from him. "You okay? You look exhausted." Jake glanced up, managing a small, weary smile. "That obvious, huh?" She nodded, a hint of concern in her gaze. "You've been running yourself ragged these past few weeks. I know you're trying to make things right, but you can't carry this weight alone." He looked down at his coffee, swirling it slowly. It feels like every step I take, there's another reminder of what I messed up. Everywhere I go, people look at me differently. And I get it, I do. I'm just not sure how much more I can take." Lisa's expression softened, and she reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Jake, you're not supposed to do this on your own. You have people here who believe in you, who want to see you succeed. But you need to let us help you." He looked up at her, the frustration and exhaustion evident in his eyes. "I don't even know what that looks like, Morales. I've spent so long doing things my way, being the one people rely on. And now, here I am, the one who needs help." She gave him a reassuring smile. "That's not weakness, Jake. It's human. And I think admitting that is the strongest thing you've done in a while." He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "I'm trying, but it's hard to shake the feeling that no matter what I do, it'll never be enough." Lisa tilted her head, her tone gentle but firm. "Jake, it's not about erasing the past. It's about showing that you've learned from it, that you're willing to do the work. Every day, step by step." He nodded slowly, her words settling over him like a balm. For the first time, he felt a sense of clarity, a small, steady light guiding him through the fog. But as much as he wanted to accept her support, a part of him still felt unworthy. Just then, Dan Keller walked into the break room. His usual no-nonsense expression softened slightly as he glanced between Jake and Lisa. He hesitated for a moment, then cleared his throat, looking directly at Jake. "Mind if I join you too?" he asked. Jake straightened, caught off guard by Keller's presence. Sure, Keller. Have a seat." Keller took a seat beside Lisa, his gaze focused on Jake, assessing. After a moment, he spoke, his tone firm but not unkind. "Jake, I wanted to talk to you about everything that's been going on. I know you've been doing a lot to make things right, and I respect that. But I also think it's time you started looking at this from a different angle. Jake frowned, unsure of what he meant. What do you mean, different angle? Keller leaned forward, his eyes steady. You're beating yourself up, and while that's understandable, it's not going to fix anything on its own. Self-reflection is important, but if it turns into self-punishment, you're going to burn out. Fast. Lisa nodded in agreement, her gaze supportive. Dan's right, Jake. This isn't about punishing yourself. It's about growth, about moving forward. Jake ran a hand through his hair, the frustration simmering beneath the surface. I want to make things right. I want to prove that I'm not the person everyone thinks I am. Keller's expression softened, a hint of empathy in his gaze. Jake, we all know you're not a bad cop, but sometimes good people make bad choices. The difference is whether or not they're willing to change. And from what I can see, you are. Jake looked down, struggling to process Keller's words. He'd spent so long convincing himself that he needed to atone, that he hadn't considered what it might mean to truly forgive himself. Lisa reached over, giving his arm a gentle squeeze. Jake, you've been carrying this weight alone for too long. But you're not alone in this. We're here for you, and so are others. Even Ruth, in her own way, has given you a chance. Don't let that go to waste. He looked up, the gratitude evident in his eyes. Thank you, both of you. I don't know how to repay any of this. Keller chuckled softly, his gruff demeanor softening. You don't owe us anything, Jake. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep showing up. Keep making the effort. A comfortable silence settled over them, each of them lost in their thoughts. But for Jake, that silence felt like a promise of support, of friendship, of a chance to rebuild himself. After a moment, he spoke, his voice filled with newfound determination. I want to be better, not just for me, but for everyone I work with, for everyone I've let down. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get there. Lisa smiled, her eyes filled with pride. That's all we ask, Jake. Just keep moving forward. Keller nodded, his expression approving. And remember, no one's expecting perfection. Just progress. Jake nodded, feeling the weight on his shoulders lighten, even if just a little. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to the person he wanted to be. As they stood to leave, Jake took a deep breath, a small smile breaking through the exhaustion. He knew the journey ahead was still long, filled with challenges and moments of doubt, but he was no longer alone. With Lisa and Keller by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next, one step at a time. A week after his talk with Lisa and Keller, Jake felt the growing strength in his resolve, even if his doubts still lingered. Every interaction became a test, a moment to put his self-awareness into practice. He knew this was just the beginning, and the hardest moments were still ahead. But what he hadn't expected was the unexpected arrival of Ruth at the precinct, and with her, the reminder of everything that had driven him to start this journey. Jake was at his desk when he saw Ruth talking with Lisa near the entrance. His stomach tightened instinctively, but he forced himself to stand, his hands smoothing his shirt as he walked over. Ruth noticed him approaching and turned to face him, her expression unreadable but calm. "Detective Ellis," Jake said, his voice steady but respectful. "Good to see you again." Ruth nodded, her gaze assessing him. "Hello, Officer Winters. I didn't expect to run into you here today." Jake hesitated, searching her eyes. I didn't expect to see you either, but I'm glad you're here. There are things I've been meaning to tell you." Ruth raised an eyebrow, her tone guarded. "Is that so? What more could there be to say?" Lisa, sensing the tension, gave Jake a quick nod of encouragement before excusing herself, leaving them alone in the quiet hallway. Jake took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. "Ruth, I know I've apologized before, but I realized something recently," he began, his voice lower, more vulnerable. "My apology wasn't just about the way I treated you. It's about the fact that I'm still learning to be someone different than I was." Ruth crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "And why does that matter to me, Jake? Why should I care about the changes you're going through?" Her words were blunt, cutting into him, but he forced himself to keep his composure. Because I want you to know that what you did, standing your ground, challenging me to face myself, it mattered. It wasn't just another case, another incident. It's something that I carry with me every day, and it's pushing me to be better. Ruth studied him, her expression softening slightly, though her eyes remained sharp. And how do I know this isn't just another attempt to clear your conscience? Another way to make yourself feel better? Jake swallowed, nodding. You don't, and I don't expect you to believe me. But I'm not here to make myself feel better. I'm here because I owe it to you, and to myself, to say these things, whether you believe them or not. There was a pause, and Jake could feel his heart pounding, every second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Ruth finally broke the silence. Her voice softened with a hint of understanding. Jake, I never set out to be someone's wake-up call, she said, her tone laced with a mixture of weariness and acceptance. But if that's what it took to get you to see things differently, then so be it. Just know that it's not my job to forgive or validate you. That's something only you can work through. Jake nodded, her words sinking deep. I understand that now, and I know it's not your responsibility to fix me or to make this any easier. But I want you to know that I'm committed to this. I'm committed to becoming the officer I should have been. Ruth looked at him, her gaze penetrating. Good. Because, Jake, people like me don't get the luxury of making mistakes like yours without consequences. We can't afford to stumble, because one wrong move can cost us everything. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, and he felt the weight of what she was saying settle heavily on his shoulders. He hadn't considered just how much his assumptions, his biases, had cost her. How the power dynamics they navigated every day were stacked against her. I know I can't change what happened, he said, his voice thick with emotion, but I can change what happens next. Ruth's eyes held his, and he saw a flicker of something in her gaze. Perhaps respect, perhaps understanding, but she didn't give it words. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the sincerity in his voice. Good. Then keep working on it, Jake. Not just for yourself, but for every person you meet. That's how you make a difference. He swallowed, feeling the sting of tears he wouldn't allow to fall, and nodded. Thank you, Ruth, for not giving up on me, for giving me the chance to learn. Ruth gave him a faint smile, the first he'd seen from her. I never did this for you, Jake, but I'm glad you're taking something away from it. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the hallway, a sense of finality lingering in the air. It felt like a closing chapter, but also the beginning of something new, a life he was only starting to understand. Jake stood there for a few moments, gathering his thoughts, the conversation replaying in his mind. As he turned to head back to his desk, he saw Lisa watching from the end of the hallway, a look of quiet pride in her eyes. You did good, Jake, she said as he approached, her voice soft. He shrugged, trying to shake off the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. I don't know if it was good, but it was honest. That's all I can offer right now. Lisa smiled, her gaze filled with warmth. Sometimes that's all anyone needs. He looked down, exhaling deeply, the weight of the day finally settling over him. I want this to mean something, you know? I don't want to go back to who I was. Lisa reached out, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. You won't. The fact that you're here, having these conversations, facing this head-on, that tells me you've already changed. Now it's just about keeping that momentum. Jake nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. You know, it's strange, but for the first time, I don't feel like I'm carrying this alone. I feel supported. Lisa's smile widened, her eyes softening. That's because you are, Jake. No one expects you to do this by yourself. You have people who care, who believe in you. Remember that. They stood in comfortable silence, the quiet hum of the precinct surrounding them. For the first time, Jake felt at peace, as if the weight of his past mistakes had finally begun to lift. He knew there was still a long journey ahead, filled with challenges, but he felt ready to face them, not just for himself, but for everyone he'd hurt along the way. As he walked back to his desk, he glanced around the precinct, seeing the familiar faces of his colleagues, the hustle and bustle of people working together toward a common goal. For the first time, He felt like he belonged, like he was part of something bigger than himself. And as he sat down, he made a silent vow to honor the trust he'd been given, to carry the lessons he'd learned, and to continue growing every day. Because, as Ruth had reminded him, this was just the beginning of his journey. It had been a few weeks since Jake's honest conversation with Ruth, and he had felt something shift within him. His days seemed brighter, his steps lighter, and he found himself approaching each interaction with a newfound sense of empathy and awareness. Yet, despite his best efforts, doubt still lingered, lurking in the quieter moments, waiting to remind him of his mistakes. One afternoon, as he was finishing up some paperwork, Jake noticed Dan Keller walk in, his expression grim and guarded. Keller approached Jake's desk, and as he drew closer, Jake could sense that something was off. Keller's usual, gruff demeanor had a more intense edge to it, as if he were holding back frustration. "Winters," Keller said. His tone clipped. "I need to talk to you. Now." Jake's stomach tightened, but he forced himself to meet Keller's gaze. "Of course, Keller. What's going on?" "Not here," Keller replied, his voice lower. He gestured for Jake to follow him into an empty conference room down the hall. Jake stood, feeling the familiar anxiety build as he followed Keller, the silence between them thick with tension. Once they were inside, Keller shut the door, crossing his arms as he faced Jake. "Keller, what's this about?" Jake asked, trying to keep his tone steady. Keller took a deep breath, his gaze hard. "I just got word that someone filed a complaint against you, referencing your behavior with Ruth. It sounds like they're reopening the investigation into how you handled that situation." Jake's face drained of color, his mind racing. "What? But I thought I was moving forward. I've been working on myself, proving that I'm committed to change." Keller's jaw tightened. "I know, and so do a lot of people here. But not everyone. There are still people who remember what happened, Jake, and for some, that's enough to call everything else into question." Jake's shoulders slumped, the familiar weight of guilt pressing down on him. "I've done everything I could to show I've changed. I've been trying so hard to make things right." Keller sighed, his gaze softening slightly. "I get that, Jake. I do. But sometimes, no matter how hard you work, people are still going to judge you based on the worst of your actions. That's just how it is." Jake clenched his fists, feeling a mixture of frustration and helplessness. "So what am I supposed to do? Just sit back and let them decide my fate?" Keller stepped closer, his voice firm. "No. You keep doing what you've been doing. You keep proving to yourself, and to the people who matter, that you're more than one mistake." Jake looked down, his voice thick with emotion. "But what if it's not enough? What if people never see past that one incident?" Keller placed a steady hand on his shoulder, his expression filled with empathy. "Then you keep going, Jake, because at the end of the day, you're not doing this for them. You're doing this for you." Jake took a deep breath, the anger and despair slowly fading as Keller's words sank in. He nodded, the determination returning to his gaze. "You're right. I can't control what people think, but I can control what I do from here on out." Keller nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit. Just remember, growth isn't always a straight line. You're going to have setbacks. What matters is how you handle them." Jake managed a small smile, feeling a flicker of hope reignite within him. "Thanks, Keller. I needed that reminder." As they left the conference room, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose, though the lingering worry about the investigation remained. He knew it would be a long road, but he was ready to keep walking it, one step at a time. Jake walked back to his desk, his mind swirling after the conversation with Keller. The news of the reopened investigation had shaken him, threatening to unravel the progress he'd made. He sat down heavily, the weight of doubt pressing down on him, the familiar voice of fear whispering that maybe, no matter how much he tried, he'd never be able to escape his past mistakes. He clenched his hands, forcing himself to take a steadying breath, grounding himself. He had come too far to let fear derail him now, but he needed clarity, someone to help him put everything into perspective. After a moment, he reached for his phone, scrolling to Lisa's number. "Hey, Morales, can we talk?" His voice was tense, betraying his unease. "Of course, she replied instantly. "I'll meet you in the lounge." When he entered the precinct lounge, he found her waiting, her face lined with concern. She gestured for him to sit, her eyes never leaving his face. "Jake, what's going on? You look troubled." He sat down across from her, his voice low and uncertain. "Morales, they reopened the investigation into my incident with Ruth. Someone filed a complaint and now everything's back under scrutiny." Lisa's brow furrowed, sympathy mingling with understanding in her gaze. "I'm sorry, Jake. I know you've been working hard to put this behind you." Jake let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his forehead. "It just feels like no matter what I do, I can't escape it. Like I'll always be that guy who messed up, no matter how hard I try to change." Lisa reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over his. "Jake, you've made incredible progress. But change doesn't erase the past, it builds on it. And sometimes, it takes longer for people to see that." He looked at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes. You think people can actually see me differently? That I'm not just fooling myself?" Lisa nodded, her gaze steady. "Absolutely. But you have to remember that change isn't about proving yourself to others. It's about becoming the person you can respect, the person who owns up to his past and still chooses to move forward." He took a deep breath, her words sinking in, anchoring him. "It's just hard, knowing that one complaint can bring everything back, like it never went away." "I know," Lisa replied softly, "but you're not the same person you were when this all started. And if you keep showing that, people will eventually see it. Give them time." Jake stared down at the table, her words easing some of the tension in his chest. "But what if this investigation? What if it takes everything I've worked for? What if it's all for nothing?" Lisa's hand tightened over his, her voice firm. "If it was really for nothing, Jake, you wouldn't be sitting here talking to me. You wouldn't be questioning yourself, pushing yourself to grow. That alone tells me you've already changed." He looked up at her, his gaze filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Morales. I don't know how I'd be getting through this without you." She smiled warmly. "You'd find a way. But I'm here to help however I can." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Jake felt the knot in his chest begin to loosen. But as he replayed the conversation with Keller in his mind, a new thought surfaced, one that he hadn't fully acknowledged before. "Lisa," he said slowly, his tone thoughtful, "I keep thinking about Ruth, about what she said, and how I can't just do this for other people. That I need to believe in it for myself." Lisa nodded, listening intently. "That's right. Real change isn't about appearances. It's about what you believe in, even when no one's watching." Jake looked down, his mind racing. What if I met with the internal review board voluntarily, before they even call me in?" Lisa's eyes widened in surprise. "You mean, you'd voluntarily sit down with them? Explain yourself, even without them asking?" He nodded slowly, his voice steady. "Yes, I think I need to. I need to tell them exactly what happened, no excuses, and take responsibility for my actions. Not because I want them to see me in a different light, but because it's the right thing to do." Lisa's expression softened, pride evident in her gaze. "Jake, that's a bold step, and it's exactly the kind of thing that shows just how much you've grown." He managed a small smile, feeling a newfound sense of purpose. "I don't know if it'll change anything, but I need to do it. For me." Lisa nodded, a look of respect in her eyes. "Then I support you, Jake. Whatever happens, know that I'm here for you." He squeezed her hand in gratitude, feeling the weight on his shoulders lift slightly. For the first time, he felt like he was taking control of his own path, not just reacting to the consequences of his past mistakes. He stood up, taking a deep breath as he prepared to make the call to the internal review board. The day of the internal review meeting arrived, and Jake found himself sitting in the waiting area outside the conference room. His palms were sweaty, and he could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears. This was the first time he had ever voluntarily walked into such a room, knowing he would have to recount every detail of his actions with Ruth and face the consequences, whatever they might be. He took a deep breath, looking around the empty hallway, trying to ground himself. He remembered Lisa's words, her unwavering belief in him, and the support she and Keller had given him. He clung to those moments as he tried to calm his nerves. The door to the conference room opened, and a young woman with a clipboard stepped out, her expression professional and unreadable. "Officer Winters," she called, her tone brisk. "They're ready for you." Jake nodded, standing up and wiping his hands on his pants before stepping into the room. Inside, 3 members of the review board sat behind a long table, their expressions impassive. The room was silent, save for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. He felt the weight of their gazes as he took a seat, his back straight, hands clasped tightly in his lap. One of the board members, a man with graying hair and a stern expression, cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Officer Winters, thank you for coming in voluntarily. We understand that you wanted to address the recent complaint filed against you regarding your conduct in the incident with Detective Ellis." Jake nodded, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Yes, sir. I believe it's important for me to take full responsibility for my actions." The man raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. "That's an unusual approach, officer. Most people come in here trying to defend themselves. Why the change in approach?" Jake took a deep breath, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "Because I know I was wrong. I acted based on assumptions and biases I hadn't fully acknowledged at the time. I treated Detective Ellis unfairly, and I deeply regret it." Another board member, a woman with short-cropped hair and piercing blue eyes, leaned forward, her gaze probing. "Officer Winters, can you walk us through what led you to make those assumptions? We want to understand your mindset at the time." He swallowed, his throat dry, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. "At the time, I thought I was doing my job. I saw Detective Ellis standing on the corner, and instead of seeing a person, I saw a potential threat. I didn't question my assumptions, and I didn't consider that she might have had a legitimate reason to be there. I let my biases take over." The third board member, a man with a softer expression but an equally firm voice, nodded thoughtfully. "And how do you feel about that now, officer?" Jake's voice grew softer, the weight of his admission pressing down on him. "I feel ashamed. I thought I was protecting people, but in reality, I was harming someone who didn't deserve it. And since then, I've been working to confront those biases and become a better officer. Someone who truly serves the community with respect." The woman with blue eyes raised an eyebrow. "What steps have you taken to address these biases?" Jake took a deep breath, grateful for the opportunity to explain. "I've sought feedback from colleagues, from people like Officer Morales, who have been helping me understand my blind spots. I've been reading, educating myself on the experiences of others. And, more than anything, I've been trying to listen. To really listen to the people I interact with, instead of jumping to conclusions." The older man nodded, his expression softening slightly. "It sounds like you've taken this seriously. But you must understand, Officer Winters, that words and promises are easy to make. Change is harder to prove. How can we trust that this won't happen again?" Jake hesitated, his heart pounding as he searched for the right words. He looked each board member in the eye, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I can't erase what I did," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I can promise that every day, I'm doing everything I can to be better. I'm committed to facing my mistakes, to learning from them. And I know that trust isn't something I can demand. It's something I have to earn, day by day." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He could feel his hands shaking slightly, but he refused to look away. He needed them to understand that this wasn't just an apology. It was a commitment. The woman with the blue eyes exchanged a glance with her colleagues before addressing him again, her tone more measured. "Officer Winters, we appreciate your honesty, and it's clear that you're taking this seriously. But understand that this process is ongoing. We'll be monitoring your performance, and we expect to see evidence of this growth you've described." Jake nodded, relief washing over him as he realized they were giving him a chance. "Thank you. I won't take this for granted." The older man leaned forward, his expression more solemn. "One last question, Officer Winters. Do you understand the importance of empathy in this line of work, and how essential it is to bridge the gap between authority and understanding?" Jake's gaze softened, his voice filled with newfound conviction. Yes, sir. I didn't fully understand it before, but I do now. This isn't just a job. It's a responsibility to serve, to protect, and to listen. I'm committed to building those bridges, even if it takes me the rest of my career. The board members nodded, and the man gestured for him to stand. Very well, Officer Winters. Thank you for your time and your candor. We'll review this case thoroughly and will notify you of our decision soon. In the meantime, continue to focus on your duties with the integrity you've shown here today. Jake stood, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. As he left the room, he felt the weight of his actions settle more firmly on his shoulders. But this time, it felt different. It was no longer a burden of shame, but a reminder of his commitment to do better. He walked down the hallway, each step filled with a quiet resolve. Outside the conference room, he found Lisa waiting, her face etched with concern. The moment she saw him, her eyes searched his face, and he gave her a small, reassuring nod. It went okay, I think, he said, his voice shaky with relief. Lisa let out a breath, her eyes softening with pride. You did it, Jake. I'm proud of you. He managed to smile, feeling the warmth of her words settle over him. I couldn't have done it without you, Morales. Thank you for pushing me, for making me face myself. She smiled, her gaze filled with both pride and compassion. You did the hard part, Jake. You chose to take responsibility, even when it was uncomfortable. That's what growth looks like. They stood in silence for a moment, each of them reflecting on how far he had. Jake felt both lighter and heavier after his meeting with the Internal Review Board. The relief of speaking openly, of admitting his mistakes without hiding behind excuses, had left him feeling unburdened, but the gravity of what lay ahead still loomed over him. He knew that every day from now on would be a test, not just for him, but for the people watching, waiting to see if his change was genuine. A few days later, Jake was on a patrol assignment, walking his beat in a neighborhood he'd passed through countless times before. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the buildings, and the hum of city life buzzed around him. He passed by small businesses, families out for a stroll, and groups of kids playing in the street, their laughter echoing down the block. As he walked, he spotted a small cafe on the corner, the same one where he had once seen Ruth. The memory of that day, the weight of his assumptions, surfaced, but he pushed it down, reminding himself that he was here to observe, to listen, to serve. Lost in thought, he didn't notice a young man approaching him until he was standing right in front of him. The man was tall, with dark skin and an expression that was equal parts cautious and determined. Jake blinked, taken aback, and instinctively took a small step back before catching himself. "Excuse me, Officer Winters?" the young man asked, his voice steady but guarded. Jake cleared his throat, nodding. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" The man looked him over, his eyes filled with an intensity that made Jake's pulse quicken. "You don't remember me, do you?" Jake squinted, searching the man's face, but nothing came to mind. I'm sorry, I don't." The man crossed his arms, a faint smirk on his lips. "Figures. I was one of the people you pulled over last year. Said I looked suspicious driving in a nice part of town." The memory hit Jake like a punch to the gut, and he felt his cheeks flush with shame. He vaguely remembered the encounter, a routine stop, one of many he had done without much thought. Back then, he would have justified it as just doing his job, but now he saw it for what it was. Another moment where he had let his biases control his actions. Jake swallowed, his voice thick. I'm sorry. I didn't realize." The young man tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. "So, what's changed, officer? Because last time, you looked at me like I was a criminal, just because of the car I was driving." Jake felt the familiar surge of defensiveness rise up, but he pushed it down, forcing himself to meet the man's gaze. "You're right. I was wrong. I let my assumptions get the best of me, and there's no excuse for that. I've been working to be better, to recognize those biases and not let them dictate my actions." The man studied him, his expression a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. And how do I know this isn't just talk? Jake took a deep breath, his voice steady. You don't. All I can do is show you, every day, that I'm trying to be different. I know it's not enough to just say it. I have to live it. The man's expression softened, but he didn't let his guard down entirely. People like me, we don't get many chances to see people in your position admit they're wrong. So forgive me if I'm not convinced just yet. Jake nodded, understanding the man's hesitation. I get it, and I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I want you to know that I'm committed to earning that trust, not just from you, but from everyone I serve. They stood in silence for a moment, the tension hanging between them like a thread stretched taut. Jake could feel the weight of his words, the truth in them, and he hoped that, in time, people would see that he meant it. The man's expression finally softened, his shoulders relaxing slightly. All right, Officer Winters, I'll hold you to that. I'll be watching, just like everyone else. Jake managed a small, sincere smile. I wouldn't expect anything less. The man gave him a final nod before turning and walking away, leaving Jake standing there, his heart racing but filled with a renewed sense of purpose. It was a small step, but it felt like a breakthrough, a moment of connection, of being seen not just as a uniform, but as a person trying to make amends. As he continued his patrol, he felt a lightness in his step, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could build something new on the ashes of his mistakes. He knew it would take time, but for the first time, he truly believed that he was on the right path. When his shift ended, he made his way back to the precinct, feeling the day's events settle over him. Lisa was waiting by his desk, and when she saw him, she gave him a knowing smile. You look different, she observed, her eyes twinkling with warmth. Jake chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. I had an interesting encounter. It reminded me that trust isn't something I can just talk my way into. I have to earn it. Lisa nodded, her smile widening. And you will, Jake. One day at a time. They stood there, a comfortable silence settling between them, the weight of the journey ahead feeling less daunting with each passing moment. The following week, Jake was scheduled to attend a community forum organized by the precinct. It was meant to bridge the gap between the police and the local residents, giving everyone a chance to voice their concerns and share ideas for a safer neighborhood. Normally, he would have viewed this as just another assignment, a formality. But now, the event felt like a real test of everything he'd been working toward. As he entered the community center, Jake could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze. Conversations quieted, eyes turned his way, and he felt the familiar prickling of judgment. He swallowed, forcing himself to stand tall, his resolve steeling with each step. Lisa caught his eye from across the room, giving him a reassuring nod. Her presence was a comforting anchor, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this journey. Taking a deep breath, Jake moved to the front, finding a seat among the officers and community members. The forum began with introductions, a few words from the precinct captain about the importance of community relations, and a promise to listen. As each resident took their turn to speak, Jake listened intently, feeling the tension rise with each story shared. Some spoke of feeling overlooked by the police, of assumptions made, of trust broken. The words hit close to home, and he felt the familiar sting of shame and regret. Finally, a woman stood up, her gaze fierce as she locked eyes with Jake. He recognized her immediately, Mrs. Thompson, a local activist who had openly criticized the department in the past. She stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with intensity. My son was pulled over by an officer last year. Pulled over and humiliated. Treated like a criminal just for driving a nice car. And I can't help but feel like it was because of the color of his skin, she said, her voice echoing through the room. Jake felt the words like a punch to his gut. He knew that her son's encounter was similar to his own actions in the past, and the guilt clawed at him, raw and unrelenting. Mrs. Thompson continued, her gaze unwavering. We hear talk of change, of accountability, but how do we know it's real? How do we know it's not just words? Jake knew he couldn't sit back any longer. He stood, the eyes of the room turning toward him. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to hold Mrs. Thompson's gaze, to face the weight of her expectations. Mrs. Thompson, he began. his voice steady but filled with remorse. "I can't speak for every officer, but I can speak for myself. I've made mistakes. I've been that officer who acted on assumptions, who didn't listen, who caused harm. And I'm sorry. I can't take back what I did, but I can take responsibility for it." The room was silent, every face turned toward him. He felt the weight of their judgment, their skepticism, but he pressed on. "I've been working to change, to be the kind of officer who listens, who sees people for who they are. I know that doesn't erase what happened to your son, or to anyone else who's been wronged. But I'm here because I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better, not just for today, but for every day forward." Mrs. Thompson crossed her arms, her gaze scrutinizing. "Words are easy, Officer Winters. How do we know you're not just saying what we want to hear?" Jake nodded, her question cutting deep but fair. "You don't, and I don't expect you to believe me right away. But I'm here to show you, every day, that I mean it. And I'm willing to keep showing up, to keep listening, until I earn that trust." She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she gave a small nod, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "I'll hold you to that, officer. For all our sakes." Jake nodded back, relief flooding through him, though he knew this was just one small step in a much longer journey. He felt the tension in the room ease slightly, as if the air itself had shifted. As the forum continued, more residents spoke up, sharing their concerns, their fears, and even their hopes. And with each voice, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of why he had chosen this path and why he had to keep moving forward. When the forum finally ended, Jake felt exhausted but grounded, the weight of his responsibilities clear but no longer paralyzing. He made his way to the exit, only to find Lisa waiting for him, her face filled with pride. "You did good, Jake," she said, her voice warm. He managed a tired smile. "Thank you, Morales. I don't know if I'm there yet, but I feel like I'm finally moving in the right direction." She placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with encouragement. "One day at a time, Jake. That's all any of us can do." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. He knew the road ahead was long, but for the first time, he felt ready to walk it, one step at a time. A few days after the community forum, Jake felt like he was finally starting to make progress. Each conversation, each decision, felt like a new step on a path he'd never expected to walk but knew he had to. The skepticism from the community was still there, but moments like the forum gave him hope that he could rebuild trust, piece by piece. One afternoon, as he was leaving the precinct, he noticed Ruth standing by the entrance, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. The sight of her brought a wave of anxiety, but he took a steadying breath and walked toward her, hoping that this conversation would bring the closure they both needed. "Detective Ellis," he greeted her, his tone respectful but tentative. "I didn't expect to see you here." Ruth gave him a small nod, her gaze steady. "I figured it was time we talked. I've heard about the forum, how you face the community. I wanted to see for myself if the things I've heard are true." Jake swallowed, feeling the weight of her words. "I'm just trying to make things right, Ruth. I know it doesn't erase what I did, but I'm doing everything I can to make amends." Ruth studied him, her eyes sharp but filled with a hint of something softer, perhaps understanding or even respect. "I won't lie, Jake. When all of this happened, I didn't believe you were capable of real change. You were defensive, quick to brush everything off. But what I saw at that forum, it was different." Jake looked down, his voice quieter. "It took me too long to see what I'd done. I thought I was just doing my job, but I was hurting people. People like you." She nodded, a faint hint of a smile on her lips. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Jake, but it's clear that you're making an effort, and that means something." There was a long silence between them, the weight of their shared past hanging in the air. Finally, Ruth spoke again, her tone softer, almost gentle. "I won't pretend that I've forgiven everything," she said, her eyes meeting his. "But I can acknowledge that you're trying, that you're facing your mistakes head-on, and that's something I respect." Jake felt a surge of gratitude, his chest tightening. "Thank you, Ruth. That means more than you know." Ruth gave him a small nod, then turned to leave, but she paused, looking over her shoulder. Keep showing up, Jake. For yourself and for everyone else. That's how you'll make this real. He nodded, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle over him as she walked away. Her words echoed in his mind, a reminder of the path he was on, a path he was determined to follow. As he turned to head back inside, he saw Lisa standing by the entrance, watching the exchange. She approached him, her face filled with pride. "You handled that well," she said, her voice warm. "You're really becoming the person you wanted to be." Jake managed to smile, the weight of the past few months lifting just a little. "I couldn't have done it without you, Morales. You've been my anchor through all of this." Lisa shrugged, a hint of a smile on her lips. "That's what friends are for, Jake. But this journey, you did it yourself. You chose to face your mistakes, to make amends. And that's something only you could do." They stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of everything they'd been through settling over them. For the first time, Jake felt like he was finally finding peace, a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. "Thank you, Lisa," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." She reached out, giving his arm a gentle squeeze. "Anytime, Jake. You've earned it." As they parted ways, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that he wasn't alone, that he had people who believed in him, and that he was ready to continue this journey, no matter how difficult it might be. A few days after his conversation with Ruth, Jake found himself back in the precinct, filing paperwork in the quiet hours of the early morning. The precinct was almost empty, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound filling the space. He'd been through countless days and nights here, but something felt different now. This place, which had once been a symbol of order and authority, had become a crucible, one that had forced him to confront his beliefs, his mistakes, and ultimately himself. As he sat there, lost in thought, Keller walked in, carrying a cup of coffee. His usual gruff demeanor softened when he noticed Jake, and he nodded toward him, taking a seat across the desk. "Still here, Winters? Thought you'd be off celebrating now that the worst is behind you," Keller said. His voice tinged with a hint of humor. Jake gave a small chuckle, shaking his head. "There's nothing to celebrate, Keller. This was never about escaping judgment. It's about living with it and letting it shape me. Besides, I'm still figuring out what comes next." Keller raised an eyebrow, looking genuinely intrigued. "What has come next for you, Winters?" Jake paused, his eyes drifting to the window, where the first light of dawn was just beginning to peek through. "I don't know, honestly, but I know I can't go back to how things were. I'm here to stay, to keep showing up every day, even when it's hard. That's what matters." Keller leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Winters, most people would have taken the easy way out. They would have brushed it off, blamed the system, or walked away. But you didn't. That says something about you." Jake felt a warmth spread in his chest at Keller's words, but he kept his tone humble. "I'm just trying to do right by the people I've hurt, Keller. I can't undo what's been done, but I can make sure I don't repeat it." Keller nodded approvingly, taking a sip of his coffee. "Well, keep it up, Winters. You're becoming the kind of officer this precinct needs." As Keller left, Jake sat back, feeling the quiet satisfaction of hard-won growth. He'd spent months wrestling with his own flaws, facing the consequences of his actions, and learning that real change was not a destination but a continuous journey. For the first time, he truly understood the weight of his role as an officer and as a person committed to serving others. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Lisa peeked her head in, a warm smile on her face. "Hey, Jake, got a minute?" she asked, stepping inside. He nodded, motioning for her to join him. "Always for you, Morales." She took a seat, her expression shifting to something more serious. "I wanted to talk to you about something. Well, I think you might find it interesting." He raised an eyebrow, curious. "What is it?" Lisa took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "The precinct is looking to start a community outreach program, something to improve relationships between officers and residents. They're looking for someone to lead it. I thought you might be interested." Jake's eyes widened, his heart skipping a beat. "Me? Led a program like that?" She nodded, her smile encouraging. You're the perfect person for it, Jake. You've been through this transformation firsthand. You know what it means to rebuild trust, to face yourself honestly. That's exactly the kind of insight this program needs. He hesitated, the weight of the offer settling over him. But are you sure they trust me with something like this? After everything? Lisa leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. Jake, you've earned that trust. You've shown everyone here what it means to take responsibility and grow from it. This isn't just a job for you anymore. It's a calling. And you'd be incredible at it. Jake felt a lump in his throat, the significance of the offer striking him deeply. He'd spent months trying to make amends, to prove to himself and to others that he was more than his mistakes. And now, here was an opportunity to take everything he'd learned and use it to make a real difference. I don't know what to say, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Lisa smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. Just say yes, Jake. You're ready for this. He looked at her, feeling a surge of gratitude, and nodded slowly. Yes, I'll do it. I'll lead the program. The relief and pride in her eyes filled him with a quiet confidence. He felt the weight of his decision settle over him, but this time, it was a weight he was ready to carry. As he left the precinct that day, the sun rising fully over the city, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose, of belonging. He walked down the street, the world around him brightening with each step, and he knew that his journey was just beginning. For the first time, he felt at peace with himself, ready to serve his community with integrity, compassion, and a commitment to growth that would guide him every day. Jake Winters was ready to make a difference, one step at a time. Jake's journey is a reminder that change isn't about saying the right things. It's about committing to them daily, even when no one is watching. Jake had to face the discomfort of his own shortcomings, to listen to those he once wronged, and to let go of his need to prove himself to others. Instead, he began focusing on becoming the person he could respect, no matter how long it took. It shows us that the path to growth is rarely straightforward. It's filled with setbacks and moments that test us. But Jake's story teaches us that by taking accountability and showing up for others, we can make a lasting difference. In our own lives, we can start by listening to those around us, challenging our own assumptions, and being honest about the areas where we need to grow. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments, like, and subscribe to join us for more stories that inspire change.